"We're going to make history," one of them whispered into the lens, just hours before it happened. The footage had no soundtrack, no emotion. Just two teenage boys calmly rehearsing murder like a school project. Everyone thought they were quiet, maybe a little strange, but harmless. What makes a teenager cross the line from fantasy to something irreversible? There was blood on the carpet, a thick, spreading stain, already darkened by time and silence, the kind of blood that sinks into fabric and memory alike. Her body lay twisted, as if still caught in motion, arms drawn upward in some final, useless gesture. Her eyes, wide open, frozen, watching something that was no longer there. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ribs and makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The officers who stepped through that front door would later say they felt it even before they saw her. A weight, a stillness that didn't belong. The television was still playing faintly in the background, the low hum of static noise blending with the hollow creak of floorboards. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance, but inside that house, time had stopped. Cassie Jo Stoddart was dead. She had been stabbed over 30 times. The wounds were concentrated, deliberate. 2 were deep enough to pierce muscle and bone. Blood had splattered along the lower wall, collected beneath her in a dark pool, and smeared across the carpet where she must have tried to move. The smell lingered, metallic, earthy, and faintly sweet, the scent of something too fresh and too final. She had been alone when it happened, or at least she believed she was. What made this scene unbearable was not only the brutality, but the absence of any apparent reason. No forced entry, no theft, no chaotic struggle, nothing out of place, except the girl. 16 years old, intelligent, kind, trusted. She was supposed to be house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. She'd promised to be responsible. She'd kept that promise, and it had killed her. At first, investigators considered the usual possibilities: an intruder, a random act. But something felt wrong. Too clean, too quiet. It was not long before attention turned to the people Cassie had seen that night. Her boyfriend, Matt, and 2 boys who had visited earlier, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik. At school, they seemed ordinary, quiet, perhaps, but polite, intelligent in their own way. But once detectives began to dig beneath the surface, a different picture began to emerge, a disturbing one. They found videos, hours of footage recorded by the boys themselves, laughing, whispering, planning, saying things no 16-year-old should be saying, much less believing. Brian spoke into the camera with an eerie calm. "We're going to make history," he said, "like Scream, like the Columbine shooters." Torey stood beside him, nodding. He barely spoke in some clips, but when he did, it was cold, clinical, detached. Together, they fantasized about killing, about watching someone die, about making a name for themselves, not in the world of art or achievement, but in blood. Their obsession wasn't just with violence. It was with the performance of it, the control, the narrative. They didn't want to simply commit murder. They wanted to document it, to be remembered for it. That's why they chose Cassie. Not because she had wronged them, not because they hated her, but because she was accessible, because she trusted them, because she would be home, alone, and she would let them in. And so they planned it. For weeks, they bought knives, gloves, masks. They recorded themselves mapping out scenarios, debating how they would do it, when, who would strike first. They practiced their lines. They fantasized about her fear. It was a game to them, but one where the end was never in question. Cassie was going to die. The only unknown was how long it would take, and whether she would scream. On that final night, they arrived under the guise of friends. They laughed, watched a movie, sat on the same couch. At some point, they excused themselves to the basement, unlocked a door, cut the power, and waited. They wanted her afraid. That much was clear. They lingered in the dark while she remained upstairs, confused, trying to keep calm. Her boyfriend eventually left, unaware of the danger just beneath his feet. And when she was finally alone, they came for her. There are moments in a crime that reveal not just the act, but the soul of the perpetrator. This was one of them. The decision to wait until she was alone, to kill her slowly, to listen to her plead, to record their thoughts afterward. It was not just cruelty. It was a desire to create a legacy, through death. When the tapes were later played in court, no one spoke. No one could, because the words were too deliberate, too vivid. The boys described the act as if narrating a scene from a movie. They even smiled. And yet, there was something else in those tapes, something more than narcissism. There was emptiness, a void where empathy should have been, a complete failure to understand the value of life, hers or their own. By the time investigators pieced everything together, the crime had already been committed, the body already buried, the town already changed. What remained were questions, endless questions. How two boys from good families could harbor such darkness, how no one had noticed, how it could happen again. But in that moment, in that quiet living room with the carpet stained and the walls still, none of that mattered. Only one thing mattered. Cassie had trusted them, and they had killed her for it. The days that followed were slow and silent, as if the town itself was holding its breath. People spoke in whispers. Cassie's name was everywhere, yet no one wanted to say it out loud. Not in the grocery store, not in the hallways of the school, not even at the kitchen table. Her photo was in the paper, her smile frozen in that awkward way school portraits always seem to be. But her absence was louder than any headline. Inside the police station, investigators were already circling. There was no forced entry, no signs of robbery. Cassie knew whoever had done this. That was clear. Her boyfriend, Matt, had been there that night. He told them about the flickering lights, the strange noises. He had sensed her unease. She had even asked if she could come home with him, just for the night. But she didn't. She stayed, because she said she'd promised to look after the house and the dogs. It was that sense of responsibility, the quiet, noble kind, that may have cost her everything. When detectives questioned Matt, he was cooperative, devastated, confused. He told them about Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik, how they had come by that evening, stayed for a while, watched part of a movie, then left. Nothing had seemed out of place, but something gnawed at the edges of his memory. Torey had texted him later asking strange questions about Cassie, about the night, about whether she was still alone. That was the moment the story began to crack. Brian was questioned first, calm at first, then nervous. His answers were vague, rehearsed. When pressed, his story shifted. Just slightly. Enough for investigators to notice. And when they obtained a search warrant and looked through his belongings, what they found tore through the silence that had settled over the town like fog. A black garbage bag, buried deep in a storage room. Inside, 2 bloody knives, a pair of gloves, a mask, and videotapes. Not surveillance footage, not some accidental recording. These were confessions, spoken directly into the camera by 2 boys who believed they were creating something, a project, a story, a legacy. In one clip, Brian holds the camera low walking through school corridors, talking about Cassie as if she were a character in a play. "She's our first victim," he says. His voice is steady, not excited, not afraid, just steady. Torey stands beside him, arms crossed, silent at first, then smiling. It wasn't a spontaneous act. It was rehearsed, scripted. There were lines, cues, even costume changes. Gloves, masks, black clothing. They had practiced what to say, what to do, how to clean up afterward, how to explain their absence. It was all there, laid out like a blueprint. What made it worse, what made it almost unbearable, was how ordinary they looked while saying it. Just two boys, in a school library, joking about foosball, filming each other between classes, planning a murder during study hall. Psychologically, the detachment is what stands out most. This was not an explosion of rage, not a cry for help. It was cold, controlled, purposeful. They spoke not of revenge or pain, but of history, of fame. They idolized killers from the past, compared themselves to fictional murderers. But they wanted to be real. They wanted to be more than shadows. And in their minds, this was the way. What they failed to understand, or perhaps refused to see, was what real horror looks like. It's not in the blood or the screams. It's in the silence left behind, the echo of a life cut short, the hollow space in a family that never quite fills. The moment a mother realizes her daughter isn't coming home, and that there's no one to blame but the people she once welcomed at her dinner table. Brian and Torey were arrested within days. When the tapes were shown to them, their faces changed. Brian cried, Torey denied. But it was there, recorded, undeniable. Every word, every plan, every lie. The town never fully recovered. How could it? There was no distance between the victim and the killers. They were classmates, friends. The line between safety and danger had been erased, not with a gunshot, but with a smile. Even now, years later, people remember where they were when they heard, what they felt, what they said to their children that night, trying to explain the unexplainable, trying to find comfort in a world where trust had been shattered and where evil had worn the face of familiarity. There is something uniquely unsettling about watching someone speak calmly about murder. No trembling voice, no racing thoughts, just a quiet, measured tone, as if they were describing the weather. That is what the tapes showed. Brian and Torey, 16 years old, sitting in a car, casually discussing how they would kill their friend. Laughing, even. Repeating her name without hesitation. They were not men consumed by rage. They were boys playing out a fantasy they had built together, piece by piece, until it felt more real than the lives around them. Cassie, in their eyes, had become a concept, an idea, a role to be filled. And once that shift happened, once they stopped seeing her as a person, everything else became easier. Planning her death became an extension of their shared identity. They weren't just best friends. They were co-authors of a script they believed no one else was brave enough to write. That kind of thinking does not come from nowhere. It grows slowly, quietly, often in isolation, in the dark corners of online forums, in whispered jokes no one else finds funny, in a shared sense of being overlooked, misunderstood, invisible. For boys like Brian and Torey, that invisibility became unbearable, and so they chose the loudest act possible to remind the world that they were here, that they mattered. The psychology of this kind of crime is layered. On one level, it is about power, the ability to take a life, to control the moment when someone else's world ends. But beneath that, there is a hunger for permanence, to be remembered, to have their names spoken long after everyone else has been forgotten. They didn't just want to kill, they wanted to be known for the killing. But that recognition came at a cost, not just to Cassie's family, not just to the community, but to themselves. Because in trying to become something greater, they became something far less. The moment of the murder itself was brutal, not just in physical terms, though it was. 30 wounds, defensive cuts, blood smeared on the walls, the floor, the edges of the furniture. But the brutality ran deeper, in the way they stood over her, in the way they made sure she was alone, in the way they recorded themselves afterward, not shaken, but proud. When Brian described it to the investigators, he said something that stayed with me. He said it didn't feel real, that it was like watching someone else do it. That's not uncommon. Dissociation is a defense, a shield between the act and the conscience. But in Brian's case, it was something more. He didn't just feel like he was watching, he wanted to be watched. Every step, every word, that was the goal. Torey, on the other hand, refused to admit his role, even in the face of the tapes, even when confronted with his own voice. He distanced himself, denied, shifted blame, but in doing so, he revealed a deeper truth. He wasn't disconnected from the crime. He was protective of it, of the narrative, of the idea that what they had done was somehow meaningful. In court, the atmosphere was heavy. You could feel the weight of every heartbeat. Cassie's family sat only feet away from the boys who had destroyed their lives. Her mother, hands trembling, held a photo of Cassie that had been taken weeks before her death. Her smile, quiet, shy, trusting. A smile she wore the last time she saw them. The verdict was swift. Life without parole. No possibility of release. They were led away in handcuffs, expressionless. Just 2 boys in oversized suits, swallowed by the gravity of what they had done. But even then, it didn't feel like closure. Because how do you make sense of something so senseless? How do you mourn someone who should still be laughing with her friends, planning college, growing up? How do you explain that the monsters weren't strangers lurking in the dark, but people you once sat beside in class? Years have passed, and the house where it happened has changed hands. New paint, new furniture. But some say the air still feels heavy there, as if something lingers. Not a ghost, exactly, but a silence that never left, a memory that waits just beneath the floorboards, and when the wind moves just right, it almost sounds like a whisper. Her name. Sometimes it is not the act of violence itself that haunts the most. It is what comes after, the quiet, the way life folds back in on itself, pretending to be normal, the way people lower their voices when they pass the house, or the way certain questions are never asked out loud. That silence is heavy. It presses into the walls, the hallways, the empty chairs where someone used to sit. Cassie Jo Stoddart was not famous before she died. She was not chasing attention. She did not crave the spotlight. Her world was small, familiar. Family dinners, homework, inside jokes. She kept to herself, mostly. Trusted carefully. She wasn't reckless. She said yes to watching the house because she wanted to help, because someone asked, because she believed, like most of us do, that if you do good, nothing bad will happen to you. But the world doesn't work like that. Not always. Sometimes evil doesn't come in the form of strangers. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, a classmate's voice, a friend's footsteps on the stairs. In the weeks after her death, people tried to explain. They looked for signs they missed. They asked how two boys could become capable of such cruelty. Some blamed the movies. Others blamed music, parenting, isolation. But nothing ever seemed to fit exactly, because the truth is never simple. It is a web of choices, beliefs, moments, and fractures. Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik were not raised to kill. They were not born monsters. But somewhere along the line, something broke. They stopped seeing people as people. And once that boundary dissolved, once empathy faded into detachment, the rest came easily. What unsettles me, even now, is how similar they looked to everyone else. They laughed. They went to class. They made plans. Torey even attended a school event the day after the murder, smiling in photos, his shirt neatly tucked in, as if nothing had happened, as if Cassie's blood wasn't still on his hands, invisible but staining everything. This duality, the mask worn in public, the horror hidden in private, is something I've seen before, but rarely this polished, rarely this young. In forensic psychology, we look for patterns, motives, risk factors, and while these boys showed some signs, narcissism, obsession with violence, social withdrawal, there was no one thing that screamed danger. That is what terrifies parents, and teachers, and peers, because it means that sometimes the danger doesn't come with a warning. It walks in, quiet, smiling, familiar. The court documents were extensive, hundreds of pages. The tapes, longer still. I watched each one, took notes, marked the shifts in tone, noted the pauses. But there was one clip I could never quite forget. Brian is sitting on the floor, the camera angled slightly above him, casting his face in soft shadow. He's holding a pen, spinning it between his fingers. His voice is low, almost bored. He says they're doing this because they need to break away from normal life. That normal is a lie. Then he looks up, just for a second, and the corner of his mouth lifts into a smile that doesn't touch his eyes. That moment is the closest I've ever come to understanding what went wrong. They didn't just want to kill. They wanted to escape their ordinariness, to matter, even if it meant someone else had to vanish. Cassie was not chosen because she wronged them. She wasn't in the way. She was simply available, kind, alone. That was enough. And now she is remembered not for the life she lived, but for the way it ended, for the fear in that dark house, for the way her voice was never heard again. Some say her name less now, as if speaking it might stir something too painful. But others remember quietly, a picture tucked in a wallet, a candle lit once a year, a pause before locking a door at night, because Cassie was real. Her smile was real, her fear, her last breath. All real. And so are the boys who took that from her. It's strange, the way a single moment can change the shape of everything around it. Before September 22nd, the town of Pocatello had been ordinary, a place where people left their doors unlocked, where the streets grew quiet after sunset, where teenagers passed notes in class and worried about college applications or Friday night plans. But after that night, something shifted. Not dramatically. There were no sirens blaring forever in the distance, no helicopters hovering overhead. Just a kind of stillness that settled into the corners of everything. A shared understanding, left unspoken. Cassie's funeral was small, intimate. Her classmates filled the pews of a quiet church, their heads bowed, their hands folded tight against their laps. Some cried openly, others sat in silence, dry-eyed but hollow. Her parents sat closest to the altar, motionless, pale. There are no words for that kind of grief, no gestures large enough to hold it. It just sits there, stretching out beyond the walls of any room it enters. Photographs line the front. Cassie as a child, smiling with her brother. Cassie holding a puppy. Cassie in a homecoming dress she never got to wear. The images felt surreal, not because they were old, but because they were so alive. You could almost believe she was still here, just in another room, waiting to come back. But she wasn't. I have always believed that funerals are for the living, for those left behind, searching for some way to make sense of what has happened. But in cases like this, sense is the one thing that never arrives. Only questions. Only the quiet hum of what-ifs. What if someone had noticed? What if she hadn't stayed? What if they had never met? Brian and Torey remained in custody, awaiting trial. They were housed separately, monitored, questioned. The videos were reviewed again and again, each frame dissected, every word transcribed. And still, nothing explained why. Why her? Why now? In psychology, we speak often about thresholds, moments where thought becomes intention, where fantasy hardens into reality. For most people, those thoughts dissolve. They remain abstract, hypothetical. But for these boys, the threshold was crossed slowly, deliberately. They stepped toward it again and again until the line disappeared altogether. There's something uniquely disturbing in how ordinary they appeared throughout the process. In the footage, their faces were relaxed, sometimes amused. At one point, Torey is seen joking about how many people they might kill. He says it casually, like he's testing the sound of the words in his mouth. There is no tremble in his voice, no weight in his eyes, only calculation. Brian, at times, seems more uncertain, more reactive. He stutters slightly when alone. He hesitates, looking toward Torey before answering certain questions. That dynamic became important during the trial. The prosecution painted Torey as the dominant one, the director. Brian, they argued, was the follower. But in my experience, responsibility does not vanish because one voice was louder. Intent hides in silence, too. The court proceedings lasted weeks. The tapes were played. Witnesses called, evidence shown. Each day, Cassie's family returned to the courtroom, seated behind the rail, watching the slow unraveling of a narrative they never asked to be part of. They did not cry loudly. They did not shout. But their presence was its own kind of testimony. When the verdicts were read, guilty on all counts, there was no applause, just a release of breath, collective and exhausted. The boys were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. They were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, heads lowered. There were no last words, no visible regret, just the soft shuffle of footsteps on the polished floor and the closing of a heavy door behind them. But justice, if it even exists in cases like this, does not erase the absence. It does not soften the memory of blood on the floor, or the sound of a mother's voice breaking in the hallway of a police station. It does not give Cassie back her voice, her future, her breath. Years have passed, and still the story lingers. It is told quietly now, in lowered voices in classrooms, in late-night conversations between parents and children. Not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder that evil does not always come with warning signs, that sometimes the most dangerous things are hidden in plain sight, in the smile of someone you trust, in the shadow of a friend, and somewhere, in a quiet house with new paint and different furniture, the air remains a little colder, a little stiller, because what happened there never really left.